historically, the jazz musicians always listen to classical music. There's instances of Coltrane playing some of the scales that Stravinsky, and then Stravinsky wrote a piece that's kind of like a jazz piece. No, there's always this distinction between is it jazz, is it classical, stylistically. But a lot of the harmonies and a lot of the some of the motives and riffs could go either way, jazz or classical. So yeah, I use a lot of classical. I mean, I play in the Philharmonic. I use a lot of classical influences, like the one tune, Present Moment No Blues, is based on a tune that was supposed to be random notes, and it was a piece by Gunther Schuller, and it's a great piece. And I just got this idea where if you know the beat is like this, then everything is off of that beat, but but if you don't know where that is, then it's random. You don't know when it's going to happen, and it makes you, it puts you in the present moment. If you allow it to, it puts you in the present moment where you're just listening, kind of staying out of time and just listening. So yeah, I use that a lot. I use classical a lot.
Yeah.
What about you?
I do use especially a lot of classical technique. Definitely when it comes to melody. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of drummers who don't study classical music, they don't really think, they think of the drums more as an impact instrument, hitting and banging, versus making a melody or making phrases that extend a certain way, and building solos based on ideas. Those things aren't usually evident in other musicians and their styles, but you'll see that a lot in jazz, like as was saying, because jazz musicians listen to tons of classical music and vice versa. In the early 1900s and throughout the 1900s, I would say, I think those two fed off each other, like frenzy feeding. Like, I mean, you hear some of the orchestral compositions made in the early 1900s, and they compare that to some of the big band compositions that Duke Ellington was doing, and sometimes you couldn't tell the difference between the two, other than the fact that one band has a drummer and an acoustic bass player, one guy playing acoustic bass versus a full orchestra, and no set player. So it's really, I think they really go hand in hand. They're intertwined more than people think.
I mean, I know for trumpet, I think it started off where trumpet was a classical instrument, and it was an instrument that was played in bands, and then the jazz guys kind of took, well, actually it wasn't trumpet at first, it was cornet,
right?
And they took it and kind of made jazz out of it, used it for jazz. But what actually started to happen was the jazz musicians started to take the instrument, the trumpet, to a higher level than the classical, and now the classical composers are now writing differently for trumpet because of the way jazz guys played it. Now there's a funny story that I guess Louis Armstrong was in a club. Louis Armstrong was known for having incredible high chops, like amazing. And even to this day, when you listen to some of his old recordings, people are like, I can't believe he was playing those notes.
Right.
So he would in a club sometimes he would hold his trumpet up, and he knew people were watching him. He would hold his trumpet and he would just kind of turn it around like this, and I guess I heard this story from a person who heard this from someone that was there, passed now.
Yeah, passed.
And he would take his trumpet and just do like this before he played, and they were wondering why he was doing that. And then he would start playing these high notes and everything. And I guess someone asked him, and he said people thought that he wasn't playing a trumpet. They thought it was a flute or a clarinet or something because they couldn't believe he was playing these notes. So he was showing them, it's just a trumpet, that's all it is, and then hit those high notes. So yeah, I mean, I think that, a lot of things came from the classical side, but there's a lot of things from the jazz side that influenced the classical.
Oh yeah, especially, I mean, jazz by nature is very, it's all about innovation.
Right.
And sometimes with classical music, I guess to a fault sometimes, but it tends to be more about the tradition. It tends to be more about sticking to what we know works. Whereas jazz is like, I'm not sure this is going to work, but I'm going to go for it anyways. And I think that, definitely that mentality inspired a lot of classical composers musicians, especially throughout the 20th century, to really like push it without regrets, just push the envelope without regrets. And some of them got shot down hard, but it really changed the trajectory of orchestral music, as well as in jazz too. You hear nowadays a lot of young composers, and even some of the older ones too, are writing music that's much more sprawling than just 32 bar changes and then you move on. It's real. It's whole compositions.
It's the whole thing about a changing world and a changing time, but something that hit, that was popular, that is now preserved. And then that thing that's preserved is now outdated. So classical music was pop music.
There was also a high degree of improvisation that was
early
part
on,
of it. Right.
Early on, it was high improvisation, and then it started to move with the time, and then at some point it got preserved. It's the kind of thing with like let's say the swing era, big band era. So that was a certain thing that was popular, and then it kind of moves on. But then there's always those people that are still in the swing thing. Now that swing is outdated now.
Right.
It's not popular. And so I think that's what happens.
Man, money really ruins a lot of things. Because you're saying there's all this improvisation in classical music in the beginning, but then as soon as the Dutches and the Dukes started, I want this in my court, they're putting lots of money at it. Well, no, it's got to be this. It's got to be structured as my courts will run. And so you kind of kill that element. And then if you look at what's being preserved now in terms of it being popular, I think the music that's preserved from the past is not what was liked the most. It wasn't the instant gratification music of the time. It was more of the stuff that after a while people said, wait a minute, this is great music.
This is really good stuff. It deserves to be.
Yeah, I mean, you look at
exactly.
Mozart, his music was sort of disregarded for years until finally someone said, wait a minute, this is good stuff. And so now it's preserved. So I think, like jazz, it's, like big band stuff's outdated, but there was quality.
It was very cool.
And so now it's preserved.
That's an interesting point, Sean, because it's a double-edged sword. I mean, you don't really hear too many people talking about the upside of preservation. You talk about how, what you hear in the dialogue a lot is how it kind of squelches creativity, but that's a really interesting point.
I mean, it's like you don't go out and burn a Monet painting because it's 100 years old. At the same time, what's the new thing that's out?
Yeah. And it's interesting because
and who decides if the new thing is quality or not? That's the thing.
It's interesting because we live in a society now where it's all about having the next hottest thing. And so what will be overlooked in that time? And I think I've always thought that you know quality when you see it. Like you can't just put it on a give it a necessarily litmus test on what's quality. It's just got to be when you hear it or you see it in other forms of art, you say that's quality. Like I know nothing. I'm no dance expert. When I see good dancing, I know that's good dancing, and that's not good dancing.
Right.